You've been around for a long time, and you've seen more than most. So tell me, is there a God?
Oh, well, what does it mean, right, God? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I have no belief in religion, and so therefore God doesn't come into it. So I have no conception of what you mean by God.
So there's nothing that you ever lost? There was no belief you ever had? Or has there been something that happened to you that made you think there couldn't possibly be a God?
No, not at all. Even as an infant child, I couldn't distinguish between religious teaching and fairy stories. So I'm not even an atheist, right? So, in other words, if atheism is on the left and religious belief is on the right, my position's somewhere to the left of atheism.
Okay. But you went, let's just sort of go back a little bit to your childhood since you brought it up. You went to a Catholic school. Can you give me a kind of thumbnail sketch of, if you had to describe the Catholicism that you encountered at school, how would you describe it?
It's quite cruel, actually. In fact, my first experience, my first day at school, in the playground, I remember there was a little garden at the end there, and I remember walking into the garden, right? There was no sign saying don't do it. And I only gone in about 5 or 6 yards, and a priest who was hiding behind a bush jumped up and belted me with a stick and belted my legs, and I came out, right, crying away, and the teacher said, it's your own fault, right, because everyone knows that Father Finn is with God, which meant he'd gone senile, and he used to hate children, right, and he used to wait for any child coming in. Well, that was my, if you like, my experience of Catholicism.
Tell me a bit more, though, about your upbringing, about your early years. What was it like to grow up in the Cundall household?
We lived and we were brought up in we were the poorest of the poor. Right, and so it was total poverty. My father never, ever, because it was during the Depression. I was born in 1927, and so my father never, ever had a job. So we lived on the dole.
And how many in your family?
Oh, 6 children.
Okay.
Right.
Where did you come?
6 of us, and I was the second eldest.
Right.
Right. And 2 died. 2 of the first ones died. One, without question, malnutrition. Right. Just appalling living conditions. Appalling living conditions. And it was terribly sad because the eldest, who was named after the Irish revolutionary, Robert Emmet, so his name was Emmet.
Yes.
He was 2 years old when he died, and a little boy of extraordinary beauty. Right, he had a great halo of golden curls. I never saw him, of course. We had a photograph of him, and he was just a little boy with a very sad face, and his eyes brimming with tears on this photograph. And my mother, I'll never forget that even when she was in her 80s and she was dying, she cried as she talked about the first son that died. This is women that never, ever forget.
Yes. The loss of 2 brothers.
Yeah.
Did this, did that loss in some way define your early life as you remember? Did it sort of hang?
Not at all,
did
no.
it drape over your household like a pall?
No, don't forget that kind of death was not uncommon in the mid-1920s,
yes.
particularly in the poverty-stricken areas, say, of Manchester or Birmingham or whatever. It was quite common. These things occurred. And in fact, there was a lot of brutality around. I mean, a lot of wife-bashing went on. Right, massive amount of it. I mean, my mother, fortunately, was a very strong woman, and she was a victim. My father used to bash hell out of her, right? And she'd go away and take us with him. Well, a great tribe of 6 kids, and go away and stay with an aunt, right? And a face all black where he'd beaten her, and then drunken rage because he used to drink, and that put me off grog forever. And you think, how terrible. And yet, I had the most extraordinarily happy childhood, right? I mean, I believe I've been unbelievably lucky. I was only just thinking about it today. It makes you so resilient, you see, to anything. I mean, they can throw anything at me. I can cop the lot. I've been there, seen that.
After school, you left school at what age?
Well, about 12. So I had the most amazing education from then on. I ran wild through Manchester, and I just ran wild. But I went to every library I could, right? And one of the marvellous things about Manchester, they're very proud of that, was that it was probably a very conservative council at one time, decided that no matter where anybody lived, there should be 3 libraries within walking distance.
Sounds like some wonderful dream.
It was. And I'll never forget my first visit to the library, because you were not allowed to go to the library until you were 8. And I was born on April the 1st, which causes great guffaws everywhere. But on April the 1st, when I was 8 years old, the head teacher came to me and said, "There you are, Peter, there is your library card." And I'd been waiting so much for this library card. And I ran to the library, ran all the way there. And it was snowing. And it was horizontal snow. So I was covered in snow down one side. I was running in shorts. You don't feel cold, right? Not when you're excited. And I dusted the snow off me and went in there and gave him a card. And she said, "Can I see your hands?" So I looked at my hands. "Go home and wash your hands." Took my card, no problem, no anger, no resentment. Ran all the way home, washed my hands, came back. Now, she said those amazing magic words, "Choose a book." Oh, that moment. And I picked Rudyard Kipling's Just So Stories.
My goodness.
And took it home and read it and came straight back. She said, "Oh, no, only one a day." And so reading has been the great passion. And eventually I was allowed to have 2 books and then 3. But I read a lot, and I wanted to go into the adult section. I read everything I could, and still do.
Peter, why? I mean, sorry, just the way that you described the library, you already prove yourself a man close to my own heart. But why did that experience move you so?
Oh, because of the sheer beauty of that moment. Choose a book. I was ushered into paradise. I loved it. It was knowledge. I mean, I remember I used to take books home. I'd look at the date stamps and find out the book that no one had wanted ever to read, right? And I'd take it home, right, just to read what it was about, you see. And it was just to find out. I remember once taking one called Crowds home. Right? And it was the most amazing book. It was about the behaviour of people when they're in a group, you know. Another one was entitled, it would look like Lead, L-E-A-D. But when I got it home, it was a technical book on lead. You see, you know, it takes you into another world, you know.
You're almost describing this like it was a spiritual experience for you. You do have religion after all, Peter. It was in that library.
Well, probably. You can call it that.
So from the sounds of it, from an early age, you learned a certain degree both of contentment, but also a kind of self-reliance. You fended for yourself, apparently.
Oh, absolutely. When I was 11, I used to wag it from school just to go to some lonely place where I could think, right? You know, kind of clay pits. And I was fascinated by the way that weeds grew. I mean, they've got the most powerful roots.
What is it that drove you to those places of solitude? I mean, I can imagine if you were living in a room with a fairly large family, was it just a craving for time with yourself, or was there some deeper urge where you needed to seek out solitude?
I love to be alone. It's strange, very offensive to some people. But it's really nice to be on your own and with your own thoughts. You know, sometimes you'd see things or read something and you want to think about it. And I used to just sit there and just think. I know it sounds weird. I'd sit there just thinking about working things out. And as I thought in my own mind, my phrase was to catch up. All I wanted to do was to catch up.
That's not a weird thing at all, though. In fact, there are great swags of the Christian and even Buddhist traditions that would describe that as contemplation. I mean, would you think of yourself as a kind of contemplative person?
Not really, but I mean, that's one of these flexible words to be, you know, to contemplate something. All it means is to think, right?
Peter, after school, you worked as a milk boy and then as a tram conductor. But towards the end of World War II, you were conscripted into the army. And it was there that you had quite a different experience of solitude. You spent 6 months in solitary confinement. What led up to the point where you saw yourself in prison?
Well, I was at a place in southeast Austria, a place called St. Paul, or St. Paul as we'd call it. And there was this 1,000-year-old monastery. And my job was guarding the SS. We'd liberated the camps. This was 1946. I'm walking around the monastery, and there's an orchard there, and I was picking apples, and suddenly a voice behind me said, "Excuse me, but will you help me with these apples? And I turned around, and there was a girl of the most extraordinary beauty, right? Blonde curls, blue eyes. And she said, "What is your name?" And I said, "Peter." She said, "Oh, Peter. Oh, Peter. Oh, what a beautiful name. Will you take me for a walk?" And I thought all my wet dreams had come at once, right? And she held my hand with this wonderful, soft little hand. But like all soldiers of 18 and 19, I was a virgin. So we actually slept the night together. And such was my innocence and sense of decency that I was still a virgin in the morning. I couldn't believe it. She had a head on my arm, and this beautiful girl, and she was too precious even to go near, if you understand. And what I didn't know, of course, that she was, in fact, was then Yugoslavia, and had been smuggling people who were in trouble in Yugoslavia, mainly the members of the Ustashi, the Croatian fascists. She'd been bringing them across. But I went along, and after a while we crossed across a little brook. And then she said to me that we are now in Yugoslavia. And I said, "Oh, I'll get into trouble." She said, "Don't worry. You'll be able to get back to your unit. But look," she said, "I've got to go away, and I'll come back and I'll take you back." Right? So she never came back. And so I'm walking out, and suddenly I came to a small road, and there was a guard in a strange uniform looking at me in a strange way. So I thought, well, what can you do? So I ducked underneath and said, "Good morning," and kept walking, and all hell broke loose. They called out the guard, dragged me back, right? And they put me in prison, and it was a little cell, only about a metre and a half wide and 2 metres long, but it was in total solitary. And in fact, you might be astonished to learn that while I was in there, there was one day was the happiest day I've ever had in my life while I was in there. The happiest day in my life.
Why was that? What happened?
Because one day they came in and they brought in a bucket and a scrubbing brush and told me to scrub the cell. And I've never been so happy at being able to do something. You've never seen a cell scrubbed. I scrubbed the walls, the floor, and I thought, this is absolute happiness. It just shows the relativity of happiness, doesn't it?
You mentioned a couple of years ago that when you came out of prison after the war, you had a weird experience that you didn't want to talk about, you didn't want to repeat. I'm intrigued. Weird how?
I'm not sure. I know that I had a strange experience, if you like, that almost became religious.
Okay, please.
Right? And that was in the nick. I'm lying there in the corner one day, and I'm looking up, and suddenly, and don't be influenced by this, floating in front of me was a golden crucifix, just floating in the air in front of my eyes. And I thought, I don't believe this. So I blinked, right, and it was still there. And I thought, and it's a reason for this, and it's not religious. And I worked it out. My cell, the main bars had been boarded up, except for one square at the top, little square. That was the only light that came in. And the bar was a cross. And I'd be looking at that cross through and to the sky. And, of course, what it had done, it had burnt itself on my eyeballs. That got you.
You can understand, though, how some people might have seen that as a sign to
Oh,
you.
indeed. Well, absolutely. And I believe that many of religious experiences are of a similar nature.
Illusions.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's widen things out a little bit and talk about how we derive meaning from different experiences in life. Tell me about something that you've witnessed that left a deep and lasting impact on your life.
Probably when I was talking to people who'd been in the concentration camps. See, they remember, we had to put them behind barbed wire again. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, well, because a lot of them wanted to kill the Germans or the Austrians in the nearby village. And it's when I was listening to the stories that they told me about what happened in the camps. I talked to a young man of, 16. He'd been in a camp since he was a child. And I said, how did you survive? He said, like a lot of other kids, we ate the dead. They used to eat the dead. You know, we never read about that. He said that only the buttocks were left. And that was the thing that moved me.
Peter, hearing what you've heard and seeing what you've seen, how have you lived with this? What's been the lasting impact of this upon you? I mean, my own great-uncle, for instance, was one of the first doctors to go into Birkenau. It haunted him for the rest of his life. He broke up with his fiancée, lived basically as a recluse.
Yeah, that's right.
This haunted him nightly.
It would do.
But what about you?
Well, it's background, right? This is the thing that has struck me a lot. I've been in 3 wars, right? I've seen a lot of dead, and it's horrifying. I've killed a lot. I was a machine gunner. I've killed a lot of people I know. It's something that it's not struck me. You see, the men that came back, for example, from Vietnam, they suffer dreadfully, you know, and it's because their background is different. They've had a relatively easy childhood and life, and when the shock comes, they're not able to absorb it as much as, say, people like myself.
Do you live with any guilt? Do you
Guilt?
feel guilty?
Only when I've inadvertently hurt people without realising.
But not from the war?
Oh, no, not at all. I remember thinking at the time, not guilt, but sheer horror. You know, what are we doing? What's happening? What's happening to the human race? What is it about the human race that they get involved in these things?
Let's move on for a moment and talk about some of the bigger questions surrounding truth and love. For many people, love is a great source of meaning in their life. How have you been loved yourself?
Well, it's funny that I feel embarrassed about being loved for some reason. Right? People say, oh, just Peter, I just love you so much. I want to fall out a hole in the ground for some reason. I don't know why, right? It's really a bit embarrassing, right? It's the only way I can put it. I mean, I've said, and it would horrify people, I don't want to be loved. I just want people to put up with me. But I don't want people to love me. You know,
do you not think you're deserving of love?
It sounds such a selfish thing to want, to be loved.
Do you not think you're deserving of love?
Oh, no, I don't actually. No, not really. But love is a form of a reward, and I don't want rewards, right? That's the way I see it.
Have you experienced profound loss or sorrow?
Yes. When my mother died, but I never expressed it, and it struck me. I was sitting on the top of a bus, 6 months later, and suddenly I thought of her, and then that moment came. That was the first time. It was probably suppressed, but I suddenly found myself bawling my eyes out. Just at that terrible sense of loss. I might add one of the saddest things I've ever heard was I don't know whether you know this, but you probably do. In action, in the front line, when men are being killed, what a lot of people don't know is that if they get very badly wounded and they're dying, they call out for their mother. Right, and that is terribly sad. You can hear it. You can hear even the people who are the so-called enemy. You can hear them calling out, and they're probably calling for their mother. It's almost something that a lot of people don't realise, that young men of 18, 19, 20, 22, they're still kids. They really are. And of course, they want to be the big men, and they go around and do all sorts of things. But at that decisive moment, they suddenly want to reach out to the one person that's always helped them and has always been there.
Let's move on to a happier note, shall we?
Yeah, thank you.
Where have you found happiness?
Oh, in the most simplest things. I mean, this will make anyone laugh because it's so ridiculous. I mean, last week I sowed my broad beans and planted some garlic. And 2 days ago I came out and saw the garlic had sprouted in the first leaves of the broad, and that filled me with the most incredible happiness, right? Happiness is such a relative thing, and it's such a simple thing.
Peter, the ancients used to describe happiness not so much as a feeling or an emotion, but rather a state of well-being in the world. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, it does. You feel, when you're happy, you feel healthy as well. You know, I mean, it's true. The last time I went to a doctor because I was sick was 1951. You know, I just don't get sick. I mean, happiness is good health. So if you can make someone happy, and this is another thing coming back to gardening. 2 days ago, I was in the Royal Tasmanian Botanical Gardens demonstrating at our little veggie patch there. It's the ABC's patch, but I went in there because they asked me. And while I'm there, I saw all these lovely kids all around. And I said to one kid, would you like a carrot? Right? He said, yes, only about 3 or 4. Would you like an Afghani carrot? Because they're purple, right? Yes, please. So I noticed other kids came up, and so I'm happy, right, watching the carrots under a tap and passing them around, and these kids are crunching away. I mean, that's the simplicity of happiness. It's giving, and the pleasure you get on seeing what you're giving being received.
Do you ever experience awe?
Oh, yes, non-stop. Non-stop. I mean, believe it or not, I mean, if I'm in the garden, I see a spider's web with a dew on it. That fills me with awe. I remember we made a television programme in a rainforest a few years ago. And I said, look at that little speck, what is it? And the cameraman said, just a minute. And he rushed back and he got another lens and screwed it on. Go on, look at this, Pete. And it was the smallest spider you've ever seen in your life. And it was glittering. Oh, we could see this little speck that glittered. And it was so little that every now and then it sent out a little filament. And then it ran across it because it was so small, even to come to the edge of a leaf was like a little cliff, right? And that was, to me, awe-inspiring in a tiny area. We saw then the little ferns coming through and small seedlings and mosses, right, growing. And that's, again, it's free. And it is happiness, and it's awe-inspiring, and it's truth, because rainforest and wilderness is absolute truth. It's cruel and it's kind, but above all, it's a place where greed doesn't exist.
Let's move on to some final things. Death and old age. You've said old gardeners never die. They just slowly turn into the most magnificent compost. Perhaps a very poignant question for you is, what is the meaning of death?
I find it hard to comprehend. On the one hand, I'm curious to find out what it's like to die. But I'm also, in my opinion, you know, that's it. There's nothing left. Once you've gone, your body will rot away, right, or be cremated. And I mean, when I said they can shove me into the nearest compost heap so I can still be working, in a way, I'm half truthful. But I'm curious to know that there's going to be a moment in my life when I'm saying, hang on, I'm dying, right? Oh, this is going to be interesting. Wonder what's going to happen next.
What then? It kind of seems strange to follow this question with that. But what then, Peter, is the meaning of life?
What is the meaning of life? Well, this is the thing. It implies the question that there is a meaning, and there isn't one, in my opinion.
What about the meaning of your life?
Well, it's what you make it, right? And so, as far as my life, it's meaningful in the sense of what can I do to help correct things that I think are wrong. The destruction of forests, the destruction of the environment, right? And what I do is pinpoint, if I can, the culprits.
So is that what makes then a life well lived? Not just allowing things to be or to decline or to go their natural route, but to actually intervene and to try to make
Absolutely.
The world what it ought to be.
You must intervene. You must get involved. I mean, what's the alternative? To stare at your navel, right? I mean, put it this way. Shakespeare, there's a most famous speech in Shakespeare comes from Hamlet. And he said, this is Hamlet, he's contemplating his own life. And he's saying, to be or not to be, to exist or not to exist. That's the question he's saying. And then he puts the real question, which is the noblest in the mind? To suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or, and he's got the alternative, to take up arms against a sea of troubles and, by opposing, end them. That's where I stand.
Peter, are you satisfied that you've lived a good life?
I'm satisfied that I've made every attempt to do so, but not for the sake of doing good. But I think it's because it's the most natural thing in the world for humans to be good. But if I wanted to sum up my life, I think that I can put it up with a kind of the reference that was given to me by my head teacher before I left school, who was amazed and horrified at my misbehaviour. A good, steady lad who tries hard. That's my summing up of my life.